The 90s was a great era in gaming, but not every release was a success. Some titles underperformed, lost money, or even flopped completely. Some were victims of circumstance, while others tried something new and bold that didn't stick. Still more did well enough in one region, but just couldn't break out globally. And of course, there were some where, well, let's just say they got what they deserved. Let's begin with this category. Developed by DreamWorks Interactive as a sequel to The Lost World Jurassic Park, Trespasser aimed to redefine gaming, but instead became a notorious flop, selling just 50,000 copies and contributing to the studio's 2000 sale to Electronic Arts. Players control Anne, a plane crash survivor stranded on Isla Sorna in what was marketed as a survival horror experience. Its standout feature was ostensibly a pioneering physics engine, letting Anne's arm manipulate objects like crates or weapons, but the controls were clunky and imprecise, often breaking immersion. And speaking of immersion, check out this weird HUD design. To check your health, you'd look down at your character's ample, chest. I mean, I guess it's unique, you gotta give it that. The dinosaur ragdolls were a mixed bag. Their lifelike flailing was innovative, yet glitchy AI caused them to get stuck in terrain or act erratically, undermining tension. The open world promised freedom, but this is a mistake a lot of open world games make. The environments just feel empty, and this makes exploration more of a boring chore with no payoff. Making matters worse, performance tanked even on high-end 1998 PCs with choppy frame rates and bugs galore. Overhyped and underdeveloped, Trespasser remains a bold but broken experiment. Bubsy 3D, unleashed in 1996, was a disastrous stab at a 3D platformer that crashed and burned. Developer Michael Berlin branded it his biggest failure, confessing that after glimpsing Super Mario 64 at the 1996 Consumer Electronics Show, he saw the writing on the wall. Bubsy was doomed, but time constraints locked in its fate. Imagine, you're just about to release your first ever 3D game. You think it's pretty good, but the technology is new, so you're really not sure what's possible. Then you see what Nintendo's been up to, but it's too late to reverse course. It definitely makes you feel a little sorry for him. But there's no denying the game's controls were a clunky mess, the graphics were a blurry eyesore, and the levels felt like a lazy afterthought. Aimed to rival Mario, it instead became a punching bag of the genre. Even voice actress Lani Minella piled on, dubbing the game a career low for her. Before this, Bubsy's 2D romps ranged from not bad to actually surprisingly good, but not even revival attempts decades later could scrub off the black mark that was Bubsy 3D. The game was a misguided, if earnest, leap into the 3D world that tripped over its own ambition, and it's gone down as a flop for the ages and a lesson in hubris outrunning skill. A rare Mario entry for a non-Nintendo console, Hotel Mario flopped for a bunch of reasons, most notably the pricey and poorly received Philips console it called home. Following the failed partnership between Philips and Nintendo to develop a CD-based add-on for the SNES, Philips decided to focus on their own home console, the CDI, but on their way out the door they managed to hold on to the expensive licensing rights to some Nintendo characters, figuring that this was a surefire way to expand into the increasingly lucrative gaming industry and make their console worth the cost. The strategy backfired because, as it turned out, a repetitive and boring game about opening and closing hotel doors can't be saved simply by featuring a red-capped Italian plumber, no matter how famous or popular said plumber is. But worse than the lackluster gameplay, the game is most notorious for its horribly acted and over-the-top cutscenes. Philips figured these full-motion cutscenes were the CDI's key success factor, and they spent a lot of resources cramming in as many as they could, but instead they became a laughingstock that most people probably never would have seen at all if it weren't for their revival as a YouTube meme in the mid-2000s. But hold on, we're not quite done with the CDI yet. Philips also thought they'd try their hand at a Zelda game or two, and the results were just as atrocious as Hotel Mario. There's just no getting around this. These games were hideous. And I get that these are the early 90s, so we're not exactly expecting Black Myth Wukong here, but consider that 1993 was the same year we got Gunstar Heroes, Star Wars Rebel Assault, or even The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and it just makes these clumsy attempts at innovating look all the more pathetic. Developer Dale DeSharon of the studio behind these games, Animation Magic, blamed Philips, who pushed excessive use of the full motion videos but without ponying up enough money to make them look good enough. He said tight timelines imposed by Philips also constrained the eventual quality. Despite the setback, Animation Magic actually survived the rest of the 90s, working on games like King's Quest VII and even a cancelled Warcraft point-and-click adventure game that would have taken place after Warcraft 2. As for the CDI, it too limped along, believe it or not, only being discontinued in 1998, but it never achieved the install base Philips hoped for, its reputation irreparably damaged by these embarrassing failures. Rise of the Robots stormed onto the scene from UK developer Mirage with a multi-million-pound marketing blitz promising a revolutionary fighting game. Hyped for its advanced AI and cutting-edge graphics, it flopped spectacularly, becoming a poster child for overhyped disasters. Lead programmer Sean Griffiths bragged that they pushed the boundaries with this game, but what was actually delivered was a sluggish, clunky mess. With just one playable character in single-player mode, a laughably limited moveset, and controls that felt like wading through mud, it was a chore to play. And the so-called advanced AI was basically just a cheater that read player inputs, turning fights into unfair, scripted slogs. Multiplayer let Player 2 take over one of the limited enemy fighters, but Player 1, for some reason, was always just locked to the standard blue guy. Mirage's PR manager Julia Coombs later confessed that expectations were set way too high. You can say that again. All the bold tech promises couldn't save Rise of the Robots from its shallow gameplay and bland design. Critics tore it apart. Edge magazine dubbed it a spectacular failure that barely qualified as a fighter. Rise of the Robots remains a cautionary tale that well-funded, dazzling hype means nothing when the product's nothing more than a broken shell. Superman, the new Superman Adventures, better known as Superman 64, hit the N64 in 1999 and quickly became a legendary disaster. Developed by Titus Interactive as a tie-in to the Superman animated series, this action-adventure game dropped players into a virtual metropolis crafted by Lex Luthor, who presumably was trying to bore Superman to death or something. Gameplay alternated between navigating repetitive flying ring sequences and tackling indoor puzzles against villains like Brainiac. The ring flying mechanic remains to this day one of the most bizarre things to behold about this game, apparently a result of heavy-handed constraints from licensors Warner Brothers and DC Comics, who barred Superman from punching real people in the game. Titus co-founder Eric Kane pointed to these political meddlings as the game's undoing. Unsurprisingly, critics and players both slammed it for unresponsive controls, monotonous tasks, and shoddy graphics. The game needed to sell around 1 million copies just to break even, so despite moving over 500K, Superman 64 was a notorious flop. Releasing in 1997, Mortal Kombat Mythology's Sub-Zero was the brainchild of series co-creator John Tobias, who really wanted to explore Sub-Zero's backstory in an interesting way. Unfortunately, the game was a colossal flop that tried to twist the brutal Mortal Kombat fighting formula into an action-adventure game and somehow lost both in the process. In the game, Sub-Zero clumsily meanders through 10 side-scrolling levels that look kinda like Mortal Kombat but definitely don't play like it. The controls are a nightmare, like pressing up to jump and strangely having a dedicated turn button that complicated every move. Toss in instant death traps and infuriating level design, and this game is honestly a rage quit machine. Critics hated it, players loathed it, and the big dream of launching a Mythology series based on other characters in the franchise was cancelled. For hardcore fans of Mortal Kombat lore, and there are some, the game stands as a prequel story tying into Mortal Kombat 4, and there were even live-action cutscenes, at least on the PlayStation version, but ultimately nothing could save this thing from its atrocious gameplay. The Fifth Element, launched in 1998 as a third-person shooter tie-in to Luc Besson's hit sci-fi film, started life full of hope, but instead played a role in the eventual bankruptcy of its developer, Callisto, by 2002. It featured 2 playable characters from the movie, Corbin Dallas, armed with an unlimited ammo gun, and Lilu, who relied on melee moves and grenades. The game blended distinct combat styles with a sci-fi flair, including mechanics like ceiling clinging and stealth-based sensor evasion. However, it faced numerous setbacks, controls that didn't respond well, a camera system that hindered gameplay, and shooting mechanics that just simply fell apart. Graphics lagged behind expectations, and poorly integrated film clips muddled the experience further. Built on the troubled Nightmare Creatures engine from the same developer, it carried over many of that game's technical flaws, compounding problems. Still, the soundtrack held up, and some movie fans found it enjoyable, though others were disappointed by how the storyline strayed too far from the movie's plot. Caught between the basic feel of pre-3D games and the depth of later 3D titles, it struggled to deliver on its ambitious ideas. This game's poor performance, alongside other failures like Nightmare Creatures 2 and The New Nightmare, helped seal Callisto's fate. Shaq Fu, launched in 1994, was a fighting game flop starring NBA icon Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq, who is of course a real-life basketball star, gets warped to a bizarre dimension and has to battle his way back. That wild premise, matching a celebrity basketball player into a martial arts fighting game, was its standout quirk, but it tanked hard. Clunky gameplay, stiff controls, and bland character designs really dragged it down, especially next to slick giants like Street Fighter 2 or Mortal Kombat, which nailed tight mechanics and had very deep and interesting rosters. Shaq Fu felt shallow, unbalanced, and rushed, its developers banking on Shaq's fame instead of polishing the actual game itself. The expensive marketing campaign featured plenty of the popular giant himself, but that just added to the mounting costs. Shaq Fu was a major multi-platform misfire, a curious relic that leaned too hard on star power and stumbled over its own sloppy execution. Plumbers Don't Wear Ties was an adult-oriented romantic comedy released in 1994 for the 3DO with a limited run on the PC. Unique as an early Western visual novel, it was marketed as a full-motion video game but instead delivered mostly still-image slideshows with subpar voice acting. The story follows John and Jane, pushed by their parents into absurd romantic misadventures. The game aimed for quirky humor but almost entirely fell flat. Critics slammed its low production quality, nonsensical plot, terrible acting, and misleading advertising. It was so bad it even hurt the 3DO's reputation to the extent that it contributed to its commercial downfall. While it's true that the console had a lot of problems, the worst of these was the disappointingly small library of games, a problem made worse when some of the games were this bad. Plumbers Don't Wear Ties later earned a sort of perverse cult status as one of the worst games ever, boosted by the Angry Video Game Nerd's 2009 review. This culminated with, of course, an enhanced re-release in 2024, cementing its legacy, for some people at least, as a so bad it's good oddity. Not every game that flopped was necessarily a bad game. Some developers bravely tried something new or different, only to find that either they were way ahead of their time or couldn't break out of a small niche fan base. Here are some games that weren't afraid to take a risk even if it didn't pan out. Planescape Torment is a PC-based RPG set in the Planescape multiverse, a unique Dungeons & Dragons campaign setting. The game's renowned for its deep philosophical story and complex characters. Players control the Nameless One, an immortal amnesiac seeking to uncover his past and the reason for his immortality. Unlike typical RPGs, it emphasizes narrative and dialogue over combat, delivering a rich, text-heavy experience. There are some interesting elements here, like changing character alignment and class based on actions, and using death as a gameplay mechanic instead of a failure state. Its exceptional writing explores themes of identity, memory, and redemption. But despite critical acclaim, the game flopped commercially. Its niche concept and unfamiliar Planescape setting, far removed from the traditional fantasy setting like Forgotten Realms, confused many gamers. The focus on story over action narrowed its audience, and the bizarre marketing campaign probably didn't help either, featuring slogans like "a corpse with irresistible sexual charisma." We have to imagine this repelled certain potential buyers. Lead designer Chris Avallone acknowledged the commercial flop, yet emphasized its critical success, and reaffirmed his commitment to story-driven games, a decision that would earn him a tremendously successful career in the decades to follow. Ultima 9 Ascension, the highly anticipated conclusion to the influential Ultima RPG series, flopped partly due to technical issues like crashing, slow frame rates, and incomplete features, but the main reason was a controversial shift away from its traditional top-down view to a third-person 3D perspective. This change seriously alienated some fans, who also resented that a focus on the new 3D functionality seemed to have represented a shift towards a more general audience at the expense of continuity with the lore from the earlier titles of the series. The failure significantly impacted developer Origin Systems, contributing to its decline and eventual closure by their publisher EA in 2004. Creator Richard Garriott reflected, "We were pushing the boundaries of what was possible, but the technology wasn't quite there yet." This overambition turned what should have been a landmark moment in gaming history, the fitting end to an important early pioneer, into an unfortunate footnote. Nights into Dreams is a Sega Saturn standout that's held up remarkably well since its release in '96. You're guiding Knights, a jester-like figure, through wild dreamlike worlds. The game's visuals blend 2D and 3D elements in a way that feels fresh and innovative even today. The scoring system shines with its focus on pulling off slick moves, encouraging you to replay levels for that perfect run. Visually, it pops with its bold colors, and this pairs perfectly with a soundtrack that's dripping in nostalgia to our modern ears. The game is touted by fans as a classic that remains tough to put down to this day. Unfortunately, gamers at the time didn't see it that way. While the failure can partly be blamed on the Saturn console's lack of success, the real issue here was there just didn't seem to be a core audience for this kind of game with its unique blend of novel gameplay mechanics and bright yet unsettling palette. Yuji Naka, the producer, expressed pride in the game but admitted its sales disappointment. There was also plenty of blame to go around, as Sega's marketing department was criticized for not showcasing the game's innovation enough. Nights into Dreams has made appearances on many a top cult classics or hidden gem list, and it did get a very welcome HD remake in 2012 that was well received. Bushido Blade, a PlayStation fighting game, seemed to have it all. The game had great-looking graphics, varied gameplay with 8 different weapons, 6 interesting playable characters, and heavyweight publishers in Squaresoft and Sony. Despite all this, it flopped commercially because of its unconventional gameplay. Unlike popular titles like Tekken or Street Fighter, which featured health bars and complex combos, Bushido Blade focused on realistic sword fighting with one-hit kills requiring precision and timing. In a genre largely dominated by rapid button mashing, the idea of precise, realistic combat confused some players, especially in North America. The magnitude of the flop here wasn't as bad as some of the others on this list, with over 700,000 copies sold over its lifetime, but these numbers were a serious disappointment for a company like Squaresoft at its peak in the 90s. Bushido Blade's bold design was both its biggest strength and the cause of its downfall. More of a swordsmanship simulator than an actual fighting game, its niche appeal limited its mainstream success. Vib-Ribbon is a visually unique and extremely interesting game that looks like it could have been developed by some solo indie dev in 2025 for release on Steam. And if it was, it might have even been a success. A rhythm game featuring a quirky wireframe bunny traversing what looks like a hand-drawn setting, Vib-Ribbon had a unique feature that seems impossibly innovative for the decade in which it was released. You could insert any standard audio CD, maybe your favorite Ace of Base album, and the game would procedurally generate a level for you out of it. Pretty cool, eh? So why did it fail? Well, just look at it. In an era remembered for flashy colors and graphical breakthroughs, the minimalist vector graphics were just not something the average consumer could wrap their head around. In fact, the game never even released in North America because Sony was so afraid of the potential backlash. Vib-Ribbon is a great example of the kind of experimentation that leads to truly memorable gaming experiences, but just couldn't find its footing in the limited landscape of the 1990s. It's hard to believe Jumping Flash released less than 5 years after Pilot Wings for the Super Nintendo, a 3D platformer that takes the basic concept of the highly successful Pilot Wings and expands on it tenfold. With impressive real 3D graphics and vastly more replayable gameplay, Jumping Flash nevertheless failed to connect with the gaming crowd of 1995. The game is often viewed in retrospect as an influential early 3D console title that set the stage for games like Crash Bandicoot and Tomb Raider in the years to come. It was a necessary first step in generating buzz for a 3D platforming genre, but unfamiliarity with the way such a game would work made potential buyers leery. The game was expected to do considerably better than it did, especially given its prominence as an early title for the PlayStation, coming out just a couple months after the console's release. And even though it didn't break through, it did develop enough of a cult following to justify a couple of sequels and re-releases. Despite languishing in relative obscurity, Jumping Flash's robotic bunny Robbit made enough of an impact to earn a small cameo in the 2024 Game of the Year Astrobot. Okay, so we're kind of cheating with this one because ToeJam and Earl did flop, but only at first. The unconventional, surreal comic satire was pitched to Sega's management as a mascot title to rival Nintendo's Mario, which is why it was deemed such a failure when initial sales numbers came in way lower than expected. However, over the next year or two, the game built a following on the back of its unanimous critical acclaim, word of mouth, and a spike in the sales of the Genesis console itself, caused by the far more successful mascot Sonic the Hedgehog. Eventually, ToeJam and Earl became a sleeper hit and a cult classic, even earning a sequel in 1993 that saw a lot more upfront commercial success. It took a while, but the game overcame its rocky start, with fans seeing past or even coming to love its niche style and quirky humor. The turnaround has been so complete that Amazon Studios has even announced that a movie adaptation's in the works. The 1995 point-and-click adventure game I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is based on the short story of the same name written by Harlan Ellison. Interestingly, even though Ellison wasn't a fan of video games, he agreed to write the story for this game, which legend has it he did on a mechanical typewriter. This game was dark. And I do mean dark. It's widely regarded as one of the darkest video games ever created, a reputation rooted in its unrelentingly bleak narrative, mature themes, and oppressive atmosphere. The game's setting is a post-apocalyptic wasteland where a malevolent supercomputer has annihilated humanity except for the 5 player characters, Gorister, Benny, Ellen, Nimdoc, and Ted. For over a century, the computer has kept these individuals alive solely to subject them to relentless psychological and physical torture. Predictably, a large number of consumers were not exactly falling over each other to buy a game that explored themes of guilt, insanity, genocide, the depths of human suffering, and other things I can't even mention here. One of the scenarios, set in a Nazi concentration camp, even had to be cut in some regions. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream achieved critical success, but the game never caught on even after re-release on Steam, where you can still find it today. If you thought some of the other games on this list were weird, wait until you see this one. Based on the dream diary of one of its creators, LSD the Dream emulator is described as a playable dream, with exploration of surreal environments being the main point of the game, rather than having any concrete goals. Creator Osamu Satu had the idea for LSD while playing a racing game, which he found boring because he was bad at video games, and he thought that it would be much more fun if the game didn't require any kind of skill to play. A game where the player is transported to a new dimension where you could experience things you never have before. He figured this was a game with the potential for a global release, for some reason, but its experimental nature and just overall weirdness kept it from achieving any amount of success, even in Japan, so his hopes were dashed. Despite the commercial failure, the game has become somewhat of a cult classic, mainly owing to its strangeness, and copies have become rare and expensive over time. An English fan translation was released in 2020 if you want to try out this unnerving piece of art. Developed by Amanic and published by Enix, Evo Search for Eden introduced an innovative concept as a side-scrolling game with an evolution-based RPG element to it. Releasing more than 15 years before Maxis' hit PC game Spore, Evo similarly let you guide a creature through time, growing stronger by evolving new weapons and other abilities, all in the name of a quest to win the hand of Gaia in marriage. There was a lot going for this game. For example, you could save up to 50 different creatures, allowing for tons of replayability. And the controls were fluid and responsive and intuitive, if a little difficult, especially during boss fights. Unfortunately, there was a lot holding this back from succeeding, mainly the niche concept itself. If consumers could get past the evolution angle, which remember was a little bit more controversial in the early 90s than it is now, at least in the West, there was still the gameplay, which was extremely grindy. So even though the game had a lot of polish and no small measure of originality, in the end it failed to catch on. In Illusion of Gaia, Will, a young boy with psychic powers, embarks on a quest to save the world from an impending dark force. Guided by the spirit of Gaia, he travels across ancient civilizations, solving puzzles and battling enemies using his ability to transform into powerful forms like the Knight Freedan and the shadow creature Shadow. The game was generally well received by critics and did manage to sell a moderate number of copies, but for the studio that managed to produce the successful ActRaiser games, and given how huge RPGs were becoming with blockbusters like Final Fantasy V and Dragon Quest V each selling millions in 1992, expectations were high. The unique setting, the 16th century age of exploration on an alternate version of Earth with unique settings like Incan ruins, the Great Wall of China, and Egyptian pyramids to explore, was interesting but confused RPG gamers that were more accustomed to traditional fantasy settings. The game was praised for its puzzles, graphics, and soundtrack, but its lack of a kind of distinct direction and purpose that its competitors in the genre had ended up making Illusion of Gaia one of the more unnoticed RPGs of the 90s. There weren't a whole lot of survivor horror games on the Super Nintendo. In fact, the genre itself was still considered fairly new and quite novel back in 1995 when Clock Tower released. Loosely based on the Italian horror film Phenomena, this point-and-click adventure has you take control of Jennifer Simpson, who's being stalked through a clock tower by the evil Scissor Man. Because of the relative rarity of survival horror games in the early 90s, Clock Tower had an uphill battle when it came to convincing players to give it a shot. As a result, the game never achieved mainstream success and didn't release outside of Japan. But despite a lack of commercial success, Clock Tower had a big impact on the genre, especially in Japan where it influenced famous and popular series like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Whether Clock Tower was technically a flop is debatable. The game's director Hifumi Kono has pointed out the game's low budget and small development team and suggested that the game sold well compared to expectations. Given this and the title's undeniable impact on the industry, its place on this list could easily be debated. All it takes is one quick glance at 1996's The Neverhood to see what made this game unique. Bucking the trend of the mid-90s toward 3D graphics, the developer went in a bold art direction of making a game entirely with claymation. In the puzzle-heavy point-and-click game, you travel through a surreal landscape to confront the evil Clog and restore the king's stolen crown. The game was developed by a ragtag group of former Shiny Entertainment devs that had worked together on Earthworm Jim, their first ever game together as a new development studio. Thus, they called themselves The Neverhood Inc., and the team was led by Doug TenNapel, who had first conceived of the idea of a plasticine world way back in 1988. Unfortunately, despite its uniqueness, by the time The Neverhood came out in '96, gamers had largely moved on from the point-and-click genre, and even from 2D graphics in general, in favor of more flashy and fast-paced games. This meant that when The Neverhood came out, its gameplay and visuals had a dated feel that turned a lot of people off. The Neverhood Inc. went on to release a couple more games, one platformer sequel to the Neverhood called Skull Monkeys, as well as 1999's fighting game Boombots, both of which also flopped, leading to the closure of the studio. It's kind of an exaggeration, but you could say I wanted to create an unfun game. These are the words of director Kazutoshi Aida during an interview about Tale of the Sun, an intriguing game where you play as a caveman on a quest to build a tower all the way to the sun out of mammoth tusks. Aida wanted to create an anti-Mario game, a game about pure exploration without any linear story that leads to a happy ending. So when you start up Tale of the Sun, you're dropped into your home village and set free to do pretty much whatever you want, with no goals, objectives, or guidance. This sandboxy open concept sort of game was pretty rare in the mid-90s, especially for consoles, and consumers didn't get it. They found the gameplay aimless and dull. It probably didn't help that the graphics were deliberately rudimentary, with blocky models and pixelated textures befitting the prehistoric theme. Critics didn't get it either though, because they thought that, deliberate or not, the game is simply crude. Harvester is a point-and-click adventure game known for its meta-commentary examination of violence in media, particularly video games. Set in the eerie fictional town of Harvest, the game follows Steve, a protagonist who awakens with amnesia and is thrust into a series of bizarre and violent scenarios. Through its self-aware design, graphic content, and player-driven choices, Harvester challenges players to confront their desensitization to violence and reflect on its role in entertainment. The narrative culminates in a pivotal choice that underscores the game's message. Depending on the player's actions, Steve can either embrace violence, becoming a serial killer, or reject it, seeking a peaceful resolution. This binary outcome directly implicates the player in the cycle of violence, suggesting that media can influence behavior and that individuals bear responsibility for how they respond. It's a powerful statement about agency, challenging players to consider how their interaction with violent content reflects their values. And people didn't get it, with critics calling it stupid and confusing. The over-the-top violence combined with the fading popularity of point-and-click adventure games resigned Harvester to flop status. Sometimes games that might otherwise have become blockbuster hits flop through circumstances that are largely beyond their control. Maybe the timing wasn't right, maybe the marketing fell flat, or maybe the competition was just better. This next category includes games that were simply casualties of fate. When it released in 1999, Shenmue was among the most expensive games ever developed. Sega took a huge risk with this game, hoping it would help drive sales of its faltering Dreamcast console. The bet did not pay off, with Shenmue selling only 1.2 million copies globally, a far cry from what was needed to break even. There's a good argument to be made that if the game had come out for PlayStation or PS2 instead of Dreamcast, it could have overtaken rival Grand Theft Auto, considering how advanced it was compared to GTA 2. In fact, looking at the two side by side, it's hard to believe they came out in the same year. Often included in lists of the greatest games of all time, Shenmue did have its faults, with the pace sometimes criticized as too slow and sections of the game forcing you to complete mundane tasks in order to progress. But fans remember the groundbreaking immersion that its open world, realism, and attention to detail brought it. The failure of Shenmue largely sealed the fate of the Dreamcast, but the game itself was kept alive with two sequels, one of which was another Dreamcast flop in 2001, and the other was caught in development hell for more than a decade. Shenmue 3 finally came out in 2019 after being saved by a Kickstarter campaign, but reviews were poor and sales were little better than its predecessors. The sequel to a moderately successful 1994 game, System Shock 2 was developed on a tiny $700,000 budget, an unbelievable fact considering how great the game looks and performs. System Shock 2 stood out by merging first-person shooter and RPG mechanics, letting players customize skills and abilities. Its gripping narrative and eerie atmosphere, set on a spaceship ruled by a rogue AI, were also groundbreaking. Its complex blend of first-person shooting, RPG, and survival horror defied mainstream genres and made it truly stand out in the crowd. Or maybe it would have, rather, if anyone had ever heard about it. The big problem for System Shock 2 is that it never got the marketing that a game like this needed in 1999, with huge competitors like Half-Life and Unreal Tournament soaking up all of the attention. A rough start for brand new development studio Irrational Games, though they'd hang in there and deliver a few standout games over their history, most notably culminating with BioShock Infinite in 2013. By 1998, LucasArts had figured out that the point-and-click adventure game that they had helped build from nothing was on its way out, and some changes were warranted. From a studio that made its name on the PC with games like Monkey Island, that meant a significant shift. But with Grim Fandango, LucasArts showed that it was not afraid to innovate in the genre that it played such a large role in popularizing. Embracing 3D graphics, a unique Aztec noir setting, switching to keyboard-driven tank controls, and upping the game with especially high-quality voice acting and sound design. If any game could breathe new life into this aging genre, it was Grim Fandango. Unfortunately, as it turned out, the timing just wasn't right. The winds had shifted towards more action-oriented 3D titles in the late 90s, and while some adventure games could still turn a profit, like Escape from Monkey Island in 2000, gamers had mostly moved on. The third Panzer Dragoon to come out for the Sega Saturn, Panzer Dragoon Saga replaced the rail shooter elements of the first two games with RPG elements, including semi-turn-based battles and random encounters, a welcome change for fans of the series and critics alike. Sega intended Panzer Dragoon Saga to compete with huge entries on competitor consoles like Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation, believing that the company with the best RPG would win the console war. And in fact, Panzer Dragoon Saga earned such praise for its story, graphics, and combat that it became one of the most acclaimed games to ever release for the troubled Saturn. So why did it flop? Well, by the time the game released in 1998, the writing was of course on the wall for Sega Saturn. In fact, Sega had largely moved on and shifted its focus entirely to the Dreamcast. Their appetite for investing in any kind of marketing or even distribution of Saturn games was extremely low, so they only printed a limited number of copies for sale, especially in the West, where they only printed around 20,000 copies. The copies sold out in the first couple days, leaving us to wonder what might have been if the company had gone all in on this classic game. Given the difficulty of emulating the Saturn, combined with uncertainty of demand, Panzer Dragoon Saga remains to this day probably the best game ever created to never have been re-released or remade even once. A sequel to the moderately successful Descent Free Space the year prior, Free Space 2 was a solid space sim with beautiful graphics and fast-paced, exciting combat. It received critical acclaim and even multiple Game of the Year awards, but unlike the first game, Free Space 2 bombed, selling only about a quarter of its predecessor. Even with a fairly efficient development process, it's likely that it failed to break even. Writing for the Daily Radar, Andrew Bubb remarked that the game was one of the most unfairly overlooked titles of the year. So what happened? Producer Jim Boone has bluntly stated that the game failed simply because classic space sims were just going out of fashion, especially games like Free Space 2, which were optimized for the joystick, a peripheral that was rapidly fading from use in the late 90s as first-person shooters rose to prominence, putting the focus back on the good old mouse and keyboard. The flop was so consequential that the developer parted ways with its publisher Interplay and was acquired by THQ the following year. Following the acquisition, the company totally shifted gears towards the action-adventure genre, creating the long-lasting Saints Row series. The failure also impacted Interplay, who had already been suffering from financial woes for years. The company would continue to limp along though, in and out of bankruptcy, and funny enough, in 2013, with the bankruptcy of THQ, they reacquired the rights to Free Space for only $7,500. 1996's Guardian Heroes is a 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up for the Sega Saturn. That sentence pretty much tells you everything you need to know about why the game was a commercial failure. Combine an unsuccessful console with a genre that's well past its prime in 2D graphics when pretty much everyone else has made the switch to 3D, and you've got a recipe for a flop, no matter how good the game is. And it is a good game. With its unique mix of beat-em-up and RPG elements, featuring deep combat with combos and special moves, an engaging story that branches and even has multiple endings, and stunning 2D graphics that could only be achieved in these waning days of the art form, Guardian Heroes should have done better than it did, and maybe it would have if it were released on a different console or in a different year. There's a certain danger with creating a game in a well-established and popular genre, and that is that no matter how polished and perfected your title is, it will always run the risk of being overshadowed by the classics that came before. Such was the fate of Hagani, The Final Conflict, an action platformer about a war between rival ninja clans. The game was praised by critics for its challenging gameplay, non-stop action, and good controls, and compared favorably to games like Ninja Gaiden and Shinobi. In fact, in a review in GamePro magazine, they concluded that Hagani was actually comparable to these established giants. And therein lies the problem, because as far as consumers were concerned, why bother buying a game that's comparable to Shinobi 3 when you could just play Shinobi 3? Yeah, there were darker graphics and some interesting gameplay mechanics, but in the end, there just wasn't enough that was new to stand out in a crowded field. Pocky and Rocky 2 is a top-down shoot-'em-up and a sequel to 1992's Pocky and Rocky. When the first game achieved a moderate amount of critical and commercial success, developer Natsumi got to work immediately on a sequel, which improved on the original in multiple ways. Its standout features include a companion system with 7 unique sidekicks, controlled by a second player, or AI, each with distinct abilities. Pocky can throw her companion at foes for powerful attacks and use magic to temporarily merge with them, unlocking special skills. The game also offers varied stage designs like auto-scrolling sections where Pocky rides mythic beasts, altering gameplay dynamics. Developed and published by Natsumi, the game released just before the North American side of the company split off to become independent. This complicated distribution and limited reach in that region. In the end, the game undersold the first Pocky and Rocky, and the company didn't try again until 2001's Pocky and Rocky with Becky on the Game Boy Advance. If you were trying to release a high-quality JRPG, a sequel to a series you recently launched with some success, and you wanted to be sure your game stood out in the crowd, there were few years that would have been worse to do it than 1995. With the absolute juggernaut mega hits Dragon Quest VI and Chrono Trigger releasing that year, as well as Trials of Mana, Arc the Lad, Romancing Saga 3, Tactics Ogre, and more, plus strong holdovers like 1994's Final Fantasy VI, Lufia 2 had a tough time holding its own. The game follows Maxim, a swordsman fated to confront the Sinistrals, godlike beings bent on destruction. With his friend Lufia, warrior Guy, and knight Dakar, Maxim journeys across the land, battling monsters and solving dungeon puzzles. Critics loved it, and the game built a small fan base of loyal gamers, but sales were nowhere near what was hoped for. The field was just too crowded for this hidden gem to make a name for itself, though it did do just about well enough to keep the series going, and 3 more games would come out in the series, culminating with Curse of the Sinistrals in 2010. Gainug, known in North America as Wings of War. Why did they spell it with an O? It's probably why it flopped. I wouldn't have bought it. Anyway, let's go with Gainug. Gainug is a scrolling shooter that came out near the peak of that genre in 1991. The excellent Sega Genesis graphics riled any shooter that released in arcades, and the idea that you were flying through the skies as a warrior angel instead of piloting an aircraft brought a bit of freshness to the concept. Similar to the RPGs of the 1995 though, there was a large crowd of scrolling shooter games in the early 90s, and people didn't have a reliable way of knowing which ones were worth playing. This meant unfortunately some that deserved more visibility got passed over. It also didn't help that Gainug positioned itself as a bit of a niche player, with punishing one-hit deaths and sometimes bizarre visuals like Stage 5's grotesque, fleshy backdrop. To top it all off, limited marketing from third-party publisher DreamWorks in North America finally sealed Gainug's fate as a flop. Mega Turrican, released in 1994 for the Sega Genesis, was a commercial failure despite its roots in the successful Turrican series, and despite several well-received improvements like the new plasma rope mechanic, a more linear action-packed design, and better graphics. Developed by Factor 5, the game faced significant hurdles. Originally planned for the Amiga, it shifted to the Genesis but then sat unreleased for a whole year due to publishers' struggles. Data East eventually published it, but the delay thrust it into a crowded platformer market, competing with blockbusters like Sonic the Hedgehog 3. This timing, alongside the Genesis nearing its life cycle's end with the Sega Saturn looming, hurt its chances. Mega Turrican also suffered from poor marketing, lacking any major promotion in magazines or trade shows. Because of all this, and despite critical praise for its graphics and gameplay, Mega Turrican was a flop, though it did do well enough to justify a couple of sequels on the Super Nintendo. Comix Zone is an incredibly unique beat-em-up for the Sega Genesis and PC that puts you in the role of Sketch Turner, a comic artist sucked into his own creation where he must fight through vibrant hand-drawn panels. The game's standout feature is its unique aesthetic, blending beat-em-up action with a visual style that mimics a living comic book. Gameplay involves navigating across pages, breaking through panel borders, and interacting with the environment. Released in 1995 in the waning days of the Sega Genesis, the game flopped commercially, due partially to being overshadowed by next-gen systems like the Sega Saturn and PlayStation. Developer Peter Morawiecki from Sega Technical Institute noted it didn't break even, and he blamed PlayStation's rising popularity stealing its thunder. Further hurting sales was the declining popularity of beat-em-ups in general as the 90s wore on. A limited print run in Japan also hurt sales, though this version would later become a collector's item. What makes the failure of Comix Zone even worse is that everyone involved really seemed to want it to succeed. Sega even bundled a rock music CD with the game for free as an add-on for people who bought it. A movie adaptation was announced by Sega in 2022, though with no news since then, fans are left wondering whether it'll ever actually happen as of 2025. Knuckles Chaotix was one of very few titles to be released for the 32X, an ill-fated add-on peripheral for the Genesis that essentially converted the aging 16-bit system into a 32-bit one. But with a high price tag and a lackluster game library, consumers found little reason to choose the 32X over an actual next-gen system like PlayStation or even the Sega's own Saturn. Named by some as one of the best games on the 32X, Knuckles Chaotix expanded on the Sonic formula with innovations like the multiplayer tethering mechanic, connecting players to a partner via a rubber band-like system. We actually have some early playable prototypes of Chaotix, which at the time was dubbed Sonic Crackers, and it featured Sonic and Tails, though these fan-favorite characters were inexplicably removed from the final version. The game did, however, introduce new characters with Team Chaotix, a trio of detectives who would go on to appear in many other Sonic entries in the future. Virtual Boy Wario Land is a platform game where Wario explores 14 underground floors, collecting treasures and battling bosses. The game's standout feature is its use of the Virtual Boy's stereoscopic 3D, enabling Wario to move between foreground and background, adding depth to platforming. Players can acquire hats, like the Bull Hat for increased strength, Eagle Hat for flying, and Dragon Hat for fire breathing, with the King Dragon Hat combining all the abilities. And mini-games between floors allow gambling for more coins and hearts. The game has served as inspiration for many titles since its release in '95, including Donkey Kong Returns, Mutant Mudds, and Shantae Advance. Releasing for the patent-pending Headache 3000, the Nintendo Virtual Boy, this entry in the Wario Land series was by far the biggest flop. But with only 770,000 units sold worldwide, pretty much every game for the Virtual Boy was a flop, making this a great example of a good game that was just a victim of circumstance. A tactical RPG and part of the Shining series that continued well into the 2010s, Shining Force 3 released in 3 interconnected scenarios, each led by a unique protagonist. Its standout synchronicity system links the 3 scenarios, letting choices in one affect the others for a unified story. But just one problem: only one of the 3 ever released outside of Japan. This incomplete localization fragmented the story, alienating global players, though the game didn't exactly do gangbusters numbers in its home country either due to the decline of the Sega Saturn, making it difficult for any games on that console to succeed. And it's a real shame too, because Shining Force 3 was unanimously praised by critics. In 2001, when Sega underwent their major shift away from manufacturing consoles, Charles Belfield, who served as Sega of America's VP of Corporate and Marketing Communications, revealed that the company had considered adapting titles from the Sega Saturn for the original PlayStation, and he specifically pointed to Shining Force 3, noting that it's an ideal game that could have seen strong sales on the PlayStation platform. However, despite these intentions, the game was never re-released on the PlayStation or anywhere else. Called one of the best Castlevania games ever, one of the best action RPGs ever, one of the best 2D side-scrollers ever, and indeed one of the best games ever, Symphony of the Night released in 1997 amid a flurry of activity in the gaming industry. Activity that was almost entirely moving in one direction: 3 dimensions. This made Konami's decision to stick to 2D for this entry very bold. They knew that by doing so they could leverage the reputation they'd built over time for tight, responsive, and challenging platforming, in addition to turning out some absolutely gorgeous pixel art-based graphics. But gamers weren't buying it. Literally. Symphony of the Night launched to the worst sales numbers in the history of the series, going back all the way to 1986. The industry had so thoroughly moved on from 2D graphics, especially for platformers, that consumers were now conditioned to equate anything that wasn't 3D with poor quality. But when critics got their hands on the game, they raved. Perfect and near-perfect scores appeared in nearly every major gaming publication. And then the word of mouth spread. The new Castlevania game was good, real good. The way it incorporated role-playing elements and exploration, but without sacrificing what made the series great in the first place: the excellent soundtrack, and even the beautiful 2-dimensional graphics. Excitement continued to build until Symphony of the Night not only overcame its abysmal launch, but became a sleeper hit, one that together with games like Super Metroid launched an entirely new genre, the Metroidvania. The world is an interesting place with lots of different cultures, each with their own unique histories and peoples. This means that sometimes there's going to be things that end up being popular in one place even when everywhere else in the world just doesn't get it. Here are some games that did well enough in one region but flopped everywhere else. Discworld is a point-and-click adventure game adapted from Terry Pratchett's satirical fantasy novels. You play as Rincewind, a bumbling wizard incapable of magic, tasked with saving the Discworld from a dragon. The game's unique charm lies in its sharp humor, mirroring the author's renowned wit, which makes sense considering he was involved in the writing. The game features hand-drawn graphics, brimming with detail, and puzzles packed with book references, which delighted longtime fans of the books. Discworld also featured standout voice acting, with Eric Idle of Monty Python fame bringing the main character to life. The game released in Europe first, and then in North America on the PlayStation and PC, and then in Japan on the Sega Saturn, but they may as well have stopped at Europe because almost nobody bought the game anywhere else. You see, the cultural relevance of Discworld outside of Europe, and even really outside the UK, is minuscule by comparison. It's hard to describe to an American just how well known and popular Pratchett is in the UK, so it makes sense for a UK developer and publisher that global expectations would be high. Definite parallels to 2024's Better Man movie about pop star Robbie Williams, who enjoys a similar disparity between his level of notoriety across the pond. Discworld did well enough in Europe to earn a sequel, which was similarly well received in Europe, and similarly completely ignored in North America. Landstalker, released in '92 for the Sega Genesis in Japan and 1 year later in North America, is an action-adventure game celebrated for its unique isometric perspective, a standout feature that added depth and complexity to platforming and combat. This perspective made gameplay both challenging and innovative, setting it apart from contemporaries. You play as Nigel, a treasure hunter navigating dungeons, solving clever puzzles, and battling diverse enemies. The engaging story mixes humor and drama, brought to life by memorable characters and a vibrant, detailed world. A catchy soundtrack really ties the whole thing together and enhances the adventurous vibe. Critics in 1992 loved the game, and even those in North America who got their hands on the import version, with Game Fan magazine's review declaring that if this was an American release, I would give it Game of the Year, it's that good. Unfortunately, when the game did release in America the following year, it largely went unnoticed. The isometric perspective that had been so innovative the year before was actually a point of frustration for Western audiences that added difficulty and confusion, but Landstalker did well enough in Japan to be re-released several times since, and has even inspired spiritual successors like Alundra and Dark Savior. 1991's Decap Attack is a weird game. Technically, it only released in North America and Europe, but it was actually a remake of a different game that came out the year before in Japan called Magical Hat's Turbo Flight Adventure. Magical Hat was a pretty short-lived anime series about a hero with, you guessed it, a magical hat that he used to fight demons. So you might be asking, what's all this got to do with Decap Attack? Well, the Magical Hat game was pretty successful in Japan, so successful in fact that developer Vic Takai wanted to release it globally, but he failed to get the licensing rights to the anime, so they reskinned the game with new art, a different plot, and changed level designs. What they landed on played almost identically to Magical Hat, but couldn't be more different aesthetically. A game about a boy using his magic hat to fight enemies instead became a really weird game about a headless mummy that chucks a skull at his enemies. It was a bizarre concept, so while the game looked really good and played very well, gamers in the West were too confused to give it a shot. Omicron, the Nomad Soul, developed by Quantic Dream, which would later achieve notoriety for games like Fahrenheit and Detroit Become Human, was an ambitious adventure game blending action, RPG, and soul transfer mechanics. Starring David Bowie, who also created the soundtrack for the game, it was an expensive game to make. Director David Cage, who had some contacts in the music business after a 15-year career as a composer, wanted to create a game that was like a movie-like experience, which was pretty creative in those days. Publisher Eidos became involved, and a senior designer there knew the guitarist Reeves Gabrels from The Cure, who had also worked with David Bowie, and so the connection was made. On the back of Bowie's star power, the Nomad Soul became a moderate success in Europe. Unfortunately, he carried a lot less weight globally, especially in America, where the game totally bombed. Americans weren't ready for this style of adventure game, and since the music scene there was more Eminem and Britney Spears and less Ziggy Stardust, there was just no appetite for a title like this. A sequel was originally planned but cancelled, with Quantic opting to move on to Heavy Rain instead. Seaman, a virtual pet game for the Sega Dreamcast, developed by Vivarium and released in 1999 in Japan and the following year in America, is often labeled a flop, but this oversimplifies its story. It sold around 400,000 copies in Japan, making it the third best-selling Dreamcast title ever there, but it faltered elsewhere with modest North American sales. To call the failure in North America unsurprising would be an understatement. I mean, just look at it. You're tasked with raising basically a fish with a human face who's constantly rude and sarcastic to you, using Leonard Nimoy's voice. It's the sort of craziness that for whatever reason just works in Japan, but it doesn't translate well anywhere else. On top of the impossible to get strangeness, Western gamers didn't love the gameplay either. It's really a virtual pet sim, not a traditional game like most would expect on a home console, so the experience is pretty slow paced and requires a lot of patience and dedication, not exactly traits that the average 1990s American gamer was known for. The voice interaction using the bundled microphone attachment did add a certain uniqueness, but let's just say that more uniqueness is the last thing that this title needed to succeed in the West. Terranigma is an action RPG for the Super Nintendo that follows Ark, a boy from the village of Krista. After opening a forbidden box, he embarks on a quest to resurrect the world destroyed by a cataclysmic event. Ark travels across continents, each tied to a phase of Earth's history to revive life and civilization. What made Terranigma exceptional was its innovative gameplay and storytelling, especially the town development mechanic where players could shape the growth of settlements through quests and interactions, enhancing the sense of immersion and agency. The narrative also stood out with its philosophical depth, delving into themes of creation, rebirth, and humanity's impact on the world. Complementing this was a soundtrack by Miyoko Kobayashi, celebrated for its emotional resonance and ability to elevate the game's atmosphere. Unfortunately, Terranigma never released in North America, since it got caught up in the closure of NX America in the year it came out. Since then, there have been pushes by fans to try to get a re-release, but developer Quintet, the same studio that did ActRaiser, Illusion of Gaia, and Soul Blazer, has left behind a confusing and difficult to navigate licensing legacy. In fact, Terranigma's artist in 2021 said in an interview, "I don't know about the director Mr. Tomoyoshi Miyazaki because he seems to have disappeared. Probably the reason why the game has not been remade nor got subsequently sold is because Mr. Miyazaki cannot be contacted." Unfortunately, it looks like fans in America will never get a proper release of this hidden gem. Created by Hideo Kojima, the famous developer behind Metal Gear, and originally released in 1988 in Japan on the PC, Snatcher came out for the Sega CD in '94 as Konami was looking to bring a more interactive experience to Western players than their first go at the console, which was '92's Lethal Enforcers. Releasing late in the Sega CD's lifecycle, Snatcher faced an uphill battle getting the attention of the American console gamers who were not inclined to prefer this kind of adventure game. Compounding problems, the game ended up being slapped with an MA-17 rating, despite massive censorship efforts, including the covering up of the nudity of the original. This limited the target audience to a small niche of older players on an unsuccessful console that was on its way out. Given all this, it's no surprise that Snatcher failed in America, selling only a couple thousand copies. When Konami decided to re-release the game for PlayStation and Sega Saturn a couple years later, they didn't even bother trying overseas. Considering the lasting impact Earthbound has had on the RPG genre and gaming more generally, it might surprise some of you to learn that the game was a commercial failure in North America despite achieving moderate success in its home country of Japan. But it wasn't for lack of trying. Rebranding the game Earthbound from Mother 2, Nintendo of America invested about $2 million in an ambitious marketing campaign. This was a substantial budget for a video game in the mid-1990s. The campaign leaned heavily into Earthbound's offbeat tone, adopting the slogan, "This game stinks," to grab attention and reflect the game's eccentric humor. To complement this, they included foul-smelling scratch and sniff stickers in advertisements and highlighted bizarre in-game elements like battling piles of vomit and walking nooses. The strategy aimed to intrigue players with the game's uniqueness. The game was also bundled with a strategy guide, with Nintendo figuring Westerners would probably need it, especially considering a general lack of familiarity with turn-based RPGs in North America. The approach completely backfired. Nobody understood the humor, and the marketing campaign probably repelled more people than it attracted. And the higher price of the game due to the inclusion of the strategy guide made the purchase all the riskier for any that might have been interested. And so Earthbound flopped in North America, selling only a tiny fraction of what it had sold in Japan. The failure was a major disappointment for Nintendo, Ape Inc., and HAL Laboratory, but these huge names would of course recover and move on to bigger and better things. The real losers in the ordeal were gamers in the West, who would have to gradually discover this timeless classic over the decades to follow. If you've made it this far, we'd really appreciate if you would consider subscribing to our channel and liking the video. Your support means a lot.